The New York Times has completely lost the trust of the people. It used to be one of the most trusted newspapers in the world, being one of the only media companies uncovering government secrets and reporting the truth. But today they've completely lost it by shoveling their own hollow political agenda. It's things like censoring offensive words from Wordle like wench that makes you ask, what really happened to the New York Times? Because you see, back in the day, the New York Times was never a propaganda tool. You see, in the early 1900s, the paper found its footing by telling objective truths without opinions and sensationalism mixed in. They gained a reputation as a serious record of history, which would further help them find their footing when the newspaper industry shrank and large conglomerates started dominating the market. And so by the 70s, the New York Times was ahead of the pack, selling over 250,000 tons of newspapers every year, as they made their perfect brand through honest reporting and delivering the truth to the world whatever the cost. And nothing proved this more than the Pentagon Papers scandal. In 1971, the New York Times gained access to classified documents on a secret study of the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, and they didn't shy away from the truth. They released it to the public despite the harsh legal consequences they could incur. They even transmitted the story through a satellite system which would spread it around the world in a matter of moments, and the US government really wasn't happy. This was like an early version of WikiLeaks, so they tried to punish the journalist who broke the news with charges of conspiracy and espionage, but it just didn't work. More leaks then revealed a smear campaign by the government to implicate the journalist on false charges, leading to the entire case being dropped and the New York Times skyrocketing in popularity. People love their unapologetic honesty in the face of authority. The New York Times even won a Pulitzer Prize for their work on the Pentagon Papers. But this success would eventually lay the groundwork for the collapse we're seeing today, because the US government really wasn't happy about having their dirty secrets exposed. But then they couldn't go after the paper or the journalist directly. There were just too many pesky freedom of the press laws to get past. So if they didn't destroy the free press, maybe they could directly control it instead. Long story short, it worked. Individuals have had to step in where news organizations have failed. Today, when they expose massive government conspiracies, they're not given awards, they're jailed for life or forced into exile. Just look at Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. They played the same role the New York Times did when it exposed government lies. But this time, they didn't have the same protection. They were banished from the country, with the CIA even trying to assassinate Julian Assange. But then this brings up the question, if things like WikiLeaks are exposing the government, what are media outlets like the New York Times doing these days? And how do they actually make their money when the whole newspaper industry is completely dead? Well, the answer to these questions lies in the early 2010s. You see, as we all know, as the 21st century began, print newspapers started to decline and fast, as the switch to online media was killing thousands of small papers. In fact, from 2005 to 2021 alone, over 2,000 US newspapers collapsed, which meant the larger newspapers like the New York Times also suffered as well, because the fact that online news was free and instantly accessible destroyed their physical sales. They only survived by moving to a paywall subscription model, which already has its own problems. But even this really wasn't enough, so the New York Times sacrificed the one thing that they had left, their objective, hard-hitting, authentic reputation. So from 2010 to 2015, the paper started printing more and more of these left-wing articles and opinion pieces, even though they acted like they were completely non-partisan. And you could start telling this by the types of words that cropped up in their articles. I mean, just over this 5-year period, articles that mentioned social justice roughly doubled, mentions of whiteness more than tripled, and articles talking about diversity and inclusion became more than 6 times as common. And it didn't hurt that this shift also matched the owner's interests and agenda. You see, the New York Times is mostly owned by the Olshbergs family, a family at the top of New York's pyramid of liberal elites. But then when you dig a little deeper, you'll find the exact same names that are always pulling the strings. Companies like BlackRock and Vanguard, who also own large shares of the paper, amounting to over $1 billion in investments between the two. Now, this trend towards a corporate, hollow, woke leftist bias can be seen across the board, but it's particularly egregious for the New York Times, as their focus on objectivity and truth makes this shift just even more jarring. Now, this wasn't really new to anyone though, and it's all part of what Noam Chomsky described as manufacturing consent, as they saw this growing shift in the media towards a corporate narrative, rather than just left or right. Because as a seemingly objective news organization, the Times' responsibility is to document history, but by letting these corporate interests in like BlackRock and Vanguard buy out huge portions of the paper, they've then let them exert influence on the paper's opinions. They can choose what's talked about by the paper and which issues receive the most coverage, and it's through these invisible tools that they can then change the narrative of history to suit their own elite agenda. For Chomsky, this is what he calls the propaganda model of communication, as he describes the ways that media companies have become the voice of corporations and the government. And one of the first points they bring up is that these media companies are driven by profits. This means that they will say whatever makes their owners money. For the New York Times and their subscription model, this mostly means pleasing their left-wing audience. but only to a certain extent. An actual left-wing doctrine that could threaten BlackRock, Vanguard, or all the other elites is rarely ever seen for this reason. Anything going against big tech, big pharma is never discussed again. And this is when economies of scale work against the people, because the media industry has been taken over by a few massive conglomerates that have preferential access to the stream of global information, and someone always has to tell the news companies the facts, and these usually come from government sources, which means that any news company that steps out of line can be starved of relevant new information, and this would lead to a loss of audience and revenue. This would lead to a loss of reputation, giving the government even more leverage over the media, not to mention all the big companies that can withdraw their investments. In fact, governments and corporations even hire people to complain and make a scene over stories that don't fit their narrative, damaging the media company's revenue and reputation, which forces them to always capitulate, along with the continued threat of always losing their investors' money if they step out of line. And so it's through these ways that the media is pushed towards certain narratives, and it's how they manufacture consent for the status quo. And for the New York Times, this is especially true, and that's why today there's this repulsive special brand of corporate liberalism that's taken hold. The one that places all of its attention on dividing people by their identity and paying lip service to diversity and social issues without ever actually changing anything at all. In fact, these are the people that want to maintain the status quo and that created the societal trends that the New York Times seems to supposedly hate. However, this move towards corporate bias did have some real benefits for the paper, as it helped them keep hold of their loyal audience of old, rich, left-leaning readers who always agree with the agenda of the elite. But for a more general audience across America, it wasn't a very welcome change, because as the more biased the New York Times got, the more people they alienated. Instead of appealing to general America, they were now dividing America. And then on top of this polarization and revenue issues, suddenly the New York Times had a recipe for disaster. Which is why, unsurprisingly, in 2014, the New York Times had to fire over 100 of their newsroom employees. And if nothing changed here, the paper likely would have continued its slow roll into mediocrity, relying on a dwindling number of long-term readers. But instead they were given a lifeline, something which would boost their ratings and would provide endless news for years to come: Donald Trump. But before we continue, I want to tell you about our video sponsor, AppMySite. With AppMySite, you can create a mobile app within just a few minutes, no coding required. Not only that, but you don't even need to be a technical person to build an app. And this isn't just a simple app. AppMySite actually enables deep integration and support for WordPress and WooCommerce websites. That's right, AppMySite supports both WordPress and non-WordPress websites. To begin with, all you need to do is sign up on the AppMySite website and then create an account. Afterwards, you enter your website URL, and then you can personalize your app in terms of look and feel. From there, you can choose what content you would like to display in your app, using lots of settings to choose the layout, user behavior, colors, etc. You can also integrate your app with Firebase, chat software, Google AdSense, etc. And then you can preview your app from within your account or on your real device. And then finally, you can publish your app to the App Store with the help of AppMySite. But it doesn't even stop there. AppMySite will then auto-publish updates to the App Store from within your account automatically. No maintenance required, they do it all. So if you want to build your own app, check out AppMySite by using the link in the description below. Now, despite how much they profess to hate Trump and everything he stood for, the media like CNN and New York Times just couldn't get enough of him. During the Republican primaries, it's estimated that Trump was given $2 billion worth of free coverage from the mainstream media, which is roughly 6 times what his opponents received. And they didn't just help him indirectly. Leaked tapes revealed CNN's president encouraging Trump to run for president and even giving him advice on how to win a CNN debate. Ironically though, one of Trump's core platforms was always stoking resentment against the left-wing corporate mainstream media. And after he did this, the media started to turn on him. But he attacked the media for a reason. They were insulting and being condescending to the unrepresented and alienated people that the coastal elites were scoffing their noses at. With Trump in office, the New York Times were given 4 more years of division and political polarization to work with, so they exploited it, pushing their editorials and actual reporting further and further left. But as they committed more to the BlackRock style of corporate leftism, they started to run into some real problems, as it's tricky to mix real factual reporting with an ideology that doesn't reflect reality, and the cracks were starting to show. However, on the surface, things seemed great, as 1 year into Trump's administration, and the New York Times' revenue soared by 10%, with their stock price rising by 20%. And by increasing the polarization and taking more money from their loyalist fanbase, the paper made their shareholders a lot richer. But despite record profits, the paper's true value, its reputation, was under serious threat. In June of 2017, they had to fire all of their copy editors, over 100 staff. Then they graciously let them compete for 50 different jobs at the paper. And this would be a grave mistake, as copy editors were the ones fact-checking and proofreading articles before they were published. and this is crucial for any news agency to get the facts right, especially for the New York Times, which used to pride itself on having the best accuracy in America, and yet at the same time they were also firing fact checkers, and instead hiring agenda pushers. One of these new appointments in 2018 was Sarah Jong, a new member of the editorial board, and it didn't take long for her history to surface. Just hours after her hiring was announced, people started bringing up these tweets where she broadcasted her hatred. The defense for this was that these tweets were contextual and meant to satirize other racial abuse, but it was weak. The Times had hired and fired another writer for exactly the same thing just months beforehand. The only difference was who her comments were towards. This double standard showed the growing bias of the New York Times, a culture of cancellation for past tweets if it didn't match their agenda. And this was one of the signs that they were moving further away from honest reporting and more towards pushing the corporate agenda. Another sign came in 2019, when the Times published a political cartoon depicting the Israeli Prime Minister and Trump. The only problem was that it was anti-Semitic, especially concerning the caricatures, and also the use of the Star of David in the cartoon. And it bears mentioning that a copy editor would have noticed this, but they were all fired. Even though the New York Times is supposed to be one of the least racist, most woke, and progressive media outlets out there. And then, instead of just retracting the cartoon and apologizing or just moving on, they got rid of all political cartoons permanently. And so a method of challenging the establishment that's been used for centuries is now gone from the Times. And it isn't hard to see who benefits from this. This is the real reason the corporate leftist agenda is pushed so hard. It restricts free speech against authority. And with Trump in office, it isn't just cartoons either. The Times has been getting rid of any articles which don't match the narrative as well. A year later in 2020, the Times published an opinion piece by Senator Tom Cotton, which advocated for the use of military force as a backup to stop out-of-control riots. People on the left reacted badly, decrying the Times' commitment to showing both sides of the argument. And at first they defended themselves, bringing up the logical point that you need two sides to a conversation to even know what you're arguing against. But it didn't take long for emotion to win out over reason, and a few days later the New York Times threw in the towel, striking the article from the record and apologizing for ever publishing it. But this flip-flop spoke to a greater tension within the paper's management over how far they should toe the party line. After they removed the article and went back on their commitments to journalism, the senior opinion article's editor resigned, and over time, people who fight back against the encroachment of corporate ideology are now being removed one by one, leaving a news agency full of hollow puppets. People have started to notice though, and it's doing irreparable damage to the New York Times' reputation, which is why you might see some reception to their propaganda, like comments saying this: "A magic 8 ball has more validity than the New York Times," or this comment which came directly from one of their YouTube posts, calling them out as, quote, "misinformation peddlers." Quite a contrast from their golden reputation just a few decades ago, and we're already seeing how this narrative-driven reporting has damaged the Times' ability to report the truth. Like for example, when people rightfully doubted the official narrative on COVID's origins, the Times would be quick to push back, but they champion this bullshit animal transmission theory with very little evidence, as they would be very quick to fall in line with the WHO and the government narrative. And to make sure it stuck, they also tried to discredit the lab leak theory, dismissing it as this far-right conspiracy. But then fast forward to today, with the lab leak theory being the most probable cause of COVID, and then the New York Times suddenly tried to push the blame on Dr. Fauci in a very shameless opinion piece. And whilst Dr. Fauci was massively complicit in this, the New York Times was just as complicit. But then why are they pushing this narrative in the first place? Well, it's just another example of public opinion tampering. By suppressing the truth for years, the New York Times took all the blame off of China until the heat had died down and people moved on. And this isn't the first time. They've pushed all sorts of narratives to help China's narrative, which speaks to the New York Times no longer being an edgy paper, but a paper for the elites, for authoritarian governments, and for the World Economic Forum. But for all their grandstanding about leftist doctrine and protecting people, the New York Times is just as greedy and ruthless as any other massive corporation, with the exact same agenda as BlackRock. For example, the New York Times had previously bought out the tech review site Wirecutter. Just like with Wordle, the business side of the agency had seen that it was a promising website, and so they bought it out whilst keeping it mostly independent. But they then used this independence to justify far lower wages for the employees, and other opaque decisions from upper management, like when they put a paywall on the site in 2021, forcing it into the same subscription model that the Time uses. However, it was only after most of the company went on strike that they were eventually forced to pay them competitive wages. Then it came out that the Wirecutter management had been accepting what they called kickbacks for good reviews on the site. Now, whilst the New York Times didn't own Wirecutter when this was happening, it still reflected poorly on them when the news broke later on, as this was the sort of corrupt upper management that was plaguing the New York Times itself. Every day, more and more people are waking up to these failures of the New York Times as a news organization. with Elon Musk in particular attacking the paper for their awful reporting, calling their feed diarrhea, and saying that their propaganda isn't even interesting. Even other news outlets have seen the blood in the water. The Spectator ran this article titled "The New York Times Blunders Again," and Politico ran it years ago, where they ran this article asking what happened to their reputation for unbiased reporting. And we all know the answer to this. So is it really any wonder they lost their checkmark on Twitter? Now, this corporate agenda that seeped into the New York Times isn't really unique. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and whilst wokeness is the most visible symptom, it helps to distract from the narrative control and silencing that comes with it. And that's the real purpose of the shift, to make profit and distract from what's really going on behind the scenes. And it's also why the New York Times' reputation for telling the truth is all but gone. They're just another puppet of the establishment. But if you want to see what happens to real journalists today who expose the system, just take a look at what happened to Julian Assange by clicking the video above.